we're going to take a look at some of the early experimental approaches to learning that are discussed in Chapter 1. Before we do that, I want to review our theory of learning and definition of learning theory. Just as a quick review here, we looked at this in the bamboo. So first thing is, what is a theory of learning? And what that means is, in order to describe what a theory of learning is, we've got to know what learning is, and we've got to know what a theory is, right? So remember, a theory is a set of explanatory laws or principles, and learning is a relatively permanent change in performance or performance potential. So it's something that we do differently now, or that we have the potential to do differently now. So a learning theory is a set of laws or principles that explains a relatively permanent change in performance or performance potential. So this whole class, we're going to be looking at how do we explain how people come about changes in performance or performance potential. Okay? Ebbinghaus was one of the early researchers who took an experimental approach to learning, and Ebbinghaus looked at what's called associationism, or the doctrine of association, in verbal learning. And he said that if ideas are connected by the frequency of their association, then we should be able to predict learning based on how often things are paired together. He worked with nonsense syllables in his verbal learning paradigm, so he would have some things that really didn't seem, were not real words, and he paired them together. He might have people pairing wub and gip, for example, or bav and gug, and my goodness. So he might have wub and gip or bav and gug, and he would say those things over and over again. Wub, gip, wub, gip, wub, gip, bav, gug, and so on. And then later he would say, ask his test subjects to recall the words that went together. When I say wub, you say gip. When I say bav, you say gug. And he said that the more times things are paired, the stronger the memory trace, the more you have to learn, the harder it is to learn, or the longer learning takes, and the longer that since something is learned, the harder it is to remember. Okay? So he came up with 3 different verifications about facts of memory. 1, when things are paired together often, we're more likely to remember them. 2, the more material there is to learn, the longer learning takes. And 3, the longer since something is learned, the harder it is to remember. So he had sort of 3 ideas about memory that he verified. Okay, 3 ideas about memory that he verified. Okay, verified, and that is more association leads to greater memory. Okay, the second one is that more material, the longer learning takes. More info, longer learning, right? Oops. Longer learning. And the third thing he came up with, or that he confirmed through his research, is that the longer it's been since you learned, the harder it is to remember. Longer since learning, harder to remember. Okay. Right? Does that make sense? Okay, so those are things that make sense to us. Well, Ebbinghaus verified them in his research. And he came up with something that was pretty important called the forgetting curve. So let's look at the forgetting curve for a minute. He says over here we have recall, the amount of recall, and here we have time. And he says right after learning occurs, we remember a lot. But I don't really know why that's happening. All right, right after learning occurs, we remember a lot. And shortly after learning occurs, we forget a lot, but then what's left is pretty stable over time. So this is the classic forgetting curve. We remember a lot initially, and then we forget a lot, and then whatever sticks with us over time is going to be with us for quite a long time. Okay. So we'll go down here to the next slide. We are going to look at Thorndike. Thorndike came up with what he called the law of effect. And he worked with animals in puzzle boxes, much like Skinner did, and we'll look at Skinner in our next chapter. And he said associations are related to actions. In other words, we associate things when we act on them. And his law of effect stated essentially that if an action leads to a satisfying result, it's likely to be repeated. If it leads to a negative result, it's likely to not be repeated. So we have action, which is a good result. It'll be repeated. We have an action. Well, let's try this again. An action with a bad result will not be repeated. Okay? And this is the precursor to operant conditioning, which we'll also look at in the next chapter through Skinner. Okay. Another early experimental approach to learning is classical conditioning, and it was discovered by Ivan Pavlov, who was a Russian physiologist. He was not a psychologist. He actually was trying to study the digestive system of dogs, and what he wanted to do was find out when exactly digestion started. And since salivation is the first step in digestion, he harnessed his little dogs up here to this little contraption, and he stuck a little tube in their mouth to measure salivation. And what he did was he would have lab attendants come in and bring not this yummy bowl of meat that it looks like here, yummy dog food, but meat powder, and put some meat powder on the dog's tongue, and then he would measure their salivation. Well, what Pavlov discovered was after a little while, the dogs would start salivating as soon as the lab attendant entered the room. So he said, okay, I'm not going to study physiology anymore. There's something more interesting going on than this. Let's look at learning. So he came up with classical conditioning. And classical conditioning is a way that we can train dogs, people, all different organisms. And essentially, this is how dog training works, or classical conditioning works. You start off with an unconditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned stimulus right here is simply a stimulus that brings about an unconditioned response. The unconditioned response is a response that is not learned, it's a response that we do instinctively. So the unconditioned stimulus is something that brings about an instinctive or unconditioned response. Okay? In this case, it's food produces salivation. Also, before conditioning, we have what's called neutral stimuli. So as we're working on how does conditioning work, we have a neutral stimulus, and that stimulus is something that does not bring about a conditioned response. So something that just brings about nothing, or that maybe is ignored. Okay, now we're going to start conditioning this animal, this dog in this case. What we do now is we pair our unconditioned stimulus, food, with our neutral stimulus, in this case a bell or a tone. Skinner actually used a tuning fork, but this is a bell. So we pair our food with our bell, and every time we present food, where did my cursor go? Okay, every time we present food, we ring the bell. And this will bring about the unconditioned response of salivation. Why? Because the dog is still responding to the food. But it's learning that the bell or tuning fork is also connected to the food. So now what happens is the conditioned stimulus brings about a conditioned response. Now the bell, rung by itself, will bring about the conditioned response of salivating. So how is a conditioned stimulus, or conditioned response rather, differentiated from an unconditioned response? Note that they're the same thing. We have salivation both cases. So how is one differentiated from the other? It's only differentiated by the stimulus that precedes it. Even though salivation is the response to both food and the bell, this is a reflexive response, this is one that's learned, and so this one is unconditioned, and this one is considered a conditioned response. And some of you may have had some experience with classical conditioning. Maybe you have cats, and you pull the pop top off the wet cat food, and the cat learns to associate that popping sound with getting fed. So now anytime you pull a pop top off, the cats come running in, even though they may not get fed. I had an experience when I was pregnant with my son that I was very nauseous during the pregnancy, and I used a particular scent of lotion. And after the pregnancy, I could no longer use that lotion because it nauseated me. So I had an unconditioned stimulus, which is all the hormones in my body that produce the unconditioned response of nausea. They became paired, the hormones became paired with the particular scent of lotion, and eventually the scent of lotion just made me nauseated. And it probably took me about 10 years before I could smell that lotion without feeling like I was going to be sick. So here's a little psychology humor for you. And when you're done reading the cartoon, take a look at this video for just a minute, and then come back and resume the video we're looking at now. Another instance of classical conditioning, or and this happens to be a very classic psychology study, and that's why I wanted to share it. We could no longer conduct this research; it would be considered unethical. Was some research that Watson and Rayner did with classical conditioning, and they worked with children and tried to see if they could condition a fear response. So take a look at this video clip, and then the final early experimental approach we want to look at is Gestalt theory. And Gestalt theorists looked at perception and more. They wanted to look at the knower's active imposition of organization on sensory data. So in other words, knowers aren't just out there taking things in. They get sensory data put into their brains, and they actively impose organization on that in order to understand things. And there's a video link here, but don't click it yet. We're going to look at a couple more slides before we start clicking that video link. Okay, so look at this. All right, what's in the middle here? We've got this display. What is this? Okay, most of you probably said, it's a pretty sloppy looking B because she can't write with that pen. That's pretty accurate. All right, let's look at the next slide. Now what is it? Looks like a 13. Some of you said it looked like a 13 before. Yeah, a little bit. Okay, and now this is the same thing in both displays. It's exactly the same character. Gestalt theory says that what we do is we take a part of something, and based on its context or based on what's around it, we try to make it into a whole, and we try to make meaning. So they also looked at how we develop insight, how we figure out how to figure out problems. So take a look at this video right now, and then come on back. So what we want to do is we want to look at learning theory that focuses on and describes the process of learning from a theoretical perspective, and we also want to look at instruction in this class. And instruction is any deliberate arrangement of events to facilitate learner acquisition of some goal. So we do things to help learners reach a goal. So the assumption that we're going to make throughout this class is that effective instruction is informed by theories of learning, and that's why we're going to study learning theories.